By 1943, the tides of war had begun to turn. Germany, once an unstoppable force, was now fighting a desperate defensive war on two fronts. The Allies were bombing cities and factories across the Reich, while Soviet armies pushed west with relentless fury. But even as the Wehrmacht crumbled, within hidden laboratories along the Baltic coast, a different kind of battle was being fought, one not of tanks and trenches, but of equations, engines, and ambition. At a secluded site on the island of Usedom, known only to a few within Hitler's inner circle, stood a research facility that looked more like a futuristic fortress than a base of war, its name Peenemünde. Here, under the direction of Wernher von Braun, Germany's brightest young engineers were building something the world had never seen, a weapon that would make geography itself meaningless. Von Braun was only in his early 30s, yet his obsession with rocketry stretched back to boyhood. His dream had always been space, to lift humanity beyond the atmosphere. But in Hitler's Germany, dreams were twisted into instruments of war. The V-2, or Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, was born not to explore but to punish. It was Hitler's answer to the Allied bombing of German cities. His promise of revenge against London, a rocket that could travel 300 kilometers, ascend nearly 100 kilometers into the edge of space, and return at 3,500 miles per hour, carrying a ton of explosives. Unlike the earlier V-1 buzz bomb, it was unstoppable, invisible to radar, faster than any interceptor, and deadly accurate for its time. By late 1943, Peenemünde was a world of secrecy and contradictions. Scientists in lab coats shared corridors with SS guards. Dreams of reaching the stars were drowned by orders demanding greater range, faster reloads, and higher casualties. The British, having intercepted fragments of German communications, grew increasingly anxious. Reports of a rocket weapon capable of striking from across the sea sounded like fantasy, until Allied reconnaissance confirmed the vast test stands and launch rails at Peenemünde. On the night of August 17, 1943, over 500 Royal Air Force bombers roared across the Baltic in Operation Hydra, the largest and most complex raid against a single experimental site in the war. The raid destroyed large portions of the facility, killed key engineers, and forced the Germans to move rocket production underground, to a grim new location, the Mittelwerk tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains. There, under the mountains' crushing silence, began one of the darkest industrial undertakings of the war. Tens of thousands of forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners were brought from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora camp to assemble the V-2 in horrific conditions. They worked 16-hour shifts in damp tunnels with no daylight, under constant threat of execution. Over 20,000 prisoners would die building Hitler's miracle weapon, more than the V-2 itself ever killed in combat. Yet even in that horror, the rockets continued to roll out. Precision-machined, polished, and painted, marvels of engineering wrapped in moral decay. By early 1944, despite Allied victories in Normandy and the crumbling Eastern Front, Hitler still believed in wonder weapons that could reverse the tide. He spoke of the V-2 as a message of retribution, a weapon that would strike terror into the heart of Britain. To the scientists, it was a technological breakthrough. To Hitler, it was divine vengeance. And so, in the late summer of 1944, the first V-2s took flight from launch sites in the Netherlands and northern Germany. Civilians in London and Antwerp would soon hear nothing. No engine, no warning, only a sudden flash of light, and then the sound that followed after the explosion, the delayed boom of a supersonic impact. For the Allied command, the question was no longer if Germany had such a weapon, but how. That question would soon drive spies, scientists and soldiers alike, into a frantic hunt across Europe to find the secret behind Hitler's rockets before the war ended, and before the Soviets did. In September 1944, Londoners once again looked to the sky, but this time there was nothing to see. No planes, no warning sirens, just the quiet hum of an ordinary morning, interrupted by a sudden flash and the deep thunder of an explosion that shattered the ground. A new weapon had arrived. The first V-2 rocket struck Chiswick, West London, on September 8, 1944. It gouged a crater 30 feet wide, destroyed homes, and killed 13 civilians. Minutes later, another hit Paris. The world's first ballistic missile had entered history. For British intelligence, the impact was as psychological as it was physical. Churchill's war cabinet demanded answers. "How?" he asked. "Can one defend against a weapon that arrives faster than sound?" The answer was simple. You couldn't. The V-2 was a machine decades ahead of its time. Standing nearly 14 meters tall, weighing over 12 tons, it used a liquid-fueled rocket engine burning a mix of liquid oxygen and 75% ethanol alcohol. Its guidance system relied on gyroscopes that kept it stable as it soared beyond the stratosphere, reaching altitudes above 80 kilometers, higher than any aircraft had ever flown. For the first time in history, man had built a weapon that crossed the threshold of space. When the rocket descended, it did so at more than 3 times the speed of sound. The blast radius could level entire streets. The psychological shock it delivered was immense. The idea that death could fall from the edge of space with no warning changed the face of modern warfare forever. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets, primarily targeting London, Antwerp, and Liège. Nearly 9,000 civilians were killed, tens of thousands injured. But while the damage was terrifying, it wasn't decisive. Each rocket required immense resources to build and launch, and by 1944 Germany was running out of both. Yet from a scientific perspective, the Allies were stunned. This was not simply another weapon. It was a glimpse of a future none of them had yet reached. British scientists scrambled to understand the mechanics. Fragments were recovered from crash sites. Intelligence agents pored over intercepted messages. Reports were compiled under Operation Crossbow, an Allied effort to identify and destroy launch sites. Despite bombing campaigns across northern France and Belgium, the rockets kept coming, launched from mobile platforms hidden under camouflage, fired and gone in minutes. The Allies could only guess at the full scope of Germany's progress. Some believed the rockets were radio-guided. Others thought they carried poison gas or even miniature nuclear warheads. The truth was simpler and more alarming. The Germans had achieved what the world's top scientists had considered impossible only a few years earlier. In the United States, physicists like Robert Goddard, who had pioneered early liquid fuel rocketry in the 1920s, were largely ignored during the interwar years. His papers had described many of the same principles now seen in the V-2, but America hadn't built on them. Germany had. When word of the V-2's power reached Washington, the U.S. military realized it was facing something that defied conventional military understanding. A weapon capable not just of destroying a city, but of bridging continents. Even as Allied armies advanced through Europe, the race to capture German technology began. In late 1944, U.S. Army intelligence created a special team under the Army Ordnance Corps, engineers and scientists tasked with locating German research before it could be lost, destroyed, or seized by the Soviets. Their objective was clear: find Peenemünde, find von Braun's team, and find the rockets. Meanwhile, deep within the collapsing Third Reich, von Braun and his engineers were preparing their escape. They knew the war was lost, but they also knew their knowledge was invaluable. Whoever captured them would inherit the future of flight, missiles and space exploration, and so, as the Allied front lines closed in, trucks loaded with documents, prototypes, and engineers began moving south, toward Bavaria, toward surrender to the Americans. The rockets, the plans, and the men who built them were about to change hands. The discovery that awaited the U.S. scientists would soon shake the very foundations of modern science. Because when they finally examined the captured V-2, they realized that Nazi Germany had not just built a weapon, they had built the first step to the stars. At the center of it all stood Wernher von Braun, tall, calm, ambitious, and disturbingly apolitical. To the world, he would later be remembered as the father of modern rocketry, the man who took humanity to the moon. But in 1943, he was an SS officer under the personal patronage of Heinrich Himmler. Von Braun's team was young, many in their 20s and early 30s, brilliant minds drawn from German universities, mathematicians, engineers, and chemists who spoke of thrust ratios and guidance systems like poets describing beauty. They worked 16-hour days driven by intellectual hunger, not ideology. Yet their brilliance was shackled to the Reich's purpose: vengeance. Inside Peenemünde, science was worshipped like a god, but morality was an inconvenience. Engineers toasted successful test launches even as thousands of slave laborers were dying underground to mass-produce the same machines. Von Braun himself would later admit, the rocket worked perfectly, except it landed on the wrong planet. He dreamed of Mars, but his rocket fell on London, the V-2 program, exposed the darkest paradox of human progress, and that the same intellect capable of imagining the stars could also build weapons of annihilation. When commanded by fear and power, each engineer faced a quiet moral war between discovery and conscience. The V-2 program exposed the darkest paradox of human progress, that the same intellect capable of imagining the stars could also build weapons of annihilation when commanded by fear and power. Each engineer faced a quiet moral war between discovery and conscience. Many convinced themselves it was only science. Many chose not to look at the corpses in Mittelwerk. It was genius without innocence. From an engineering perspective, the V-2 should not have been possible in 1942. Its design required mastery of physics, metallurgy, chemistry, and control systems decades ahead of their time. At its heart was the A4 engine, a 25-ton thrust behemoth burning liquid oxygen and ethanol. The engine chamber reached temperatures over 2,500 degrees Celsius, requiring new alloys and cooling systems that no other nation had perfected. The Germans developed regenerative cooling, circulating fuel around the chamber walls to prevent them from melting, a technique still used in modern rockets today. The guidance system used a complex network of gyroscopes and analog computers to stabilize flight and control thrust. These tiny spinning instruments fed data to servo motors that adjusted the rocket's fins mid-flight. It was a machine that literally thought in mechanical impulses, decades before digital computing. Every component had to be flawless. A single leak, a frozen valve, or a gyroscopic misalignment would destroy the missile within seconds. And yet, under mountains of rock in darkness lit by torches, thousands of these rockets were built by hand. The V-2 was not only the world's first ballistic missile, it was the first human-made object to cross the boundary of space. For a brief moment, each launch from Peenemünde or The Hague pierced the edge of the stratosphere before plunging back to Earth. When Allied scientists later saw the internal systems, they were stunned. The US and Britain were still struggling to develop basic turbojet engines. America's own rocketry program, scattered across universities and small labs, had never even tested a liquid-fueled engine of this scale. The V-2 wasn't just a weapon, it was a prototype of the future. It contained the DNA of every missile, every space launch vehicle, every spacecraft that would follow. Its technology was a brutal, premature leap, one born from desperation rather than vision. But as one American scientist would later say after examining it at White Sands, we thought we were at the frontier of science, until we saw the V-2 and realized we hadn't even reached the gate. The human mind had created something extraordinary and monstrous. But in war, genius alone doesn't decide victory. Tactics, intelligence, and the ability to adapt decide survival. And while Germany built rockets, the Allies were building networks, spies, analysts, and scientists determined to uncover the truth about Hitler's miracle weapon. By late 1944, Germany's military position was untenable. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. The Allies had landed in France, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was shattered. Hitler's generals knew the war was lost through conventional means. That's when Hitler turned to what he called Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, jet fighters, guided bombs, super tanks, and above them all, the V-2. The tactical idea behind the rocket was seductive, a weapon that required no pilot, no airfield, and could strike any target within hundreds of miles. Fired from mobile launch platforms hidden in forests or barns, the rocket could be fueled, aimed, and launched in under 2 hours. It arced through the upper atmosphere, then plunged vertically at supersonic speed, hitting its target with no warning and no defense. But tactically, the V-2 was flawed. Its accuracy, in a circular error of several kilometers, meant it was a terror weapon, not a strategic one. Each rocket cost the equivalent of a small fighter plane, yet it could only kill a handful of civilians per launch. The weapon's true impact was psychological. Londoners lived under an invisible threat. Their first sign of an attack was destruction itself. Hitler hoped this would break morale, forcing the Allies to negotiate. But instead, it hardened British resolve. Churchill refused to reveal the extent of the damage, ordering news of V-2 strikes censored to avoid panic. Meanwhile, Allied bombers targeted suspected launch sites across Belgium and the Netherlands under Operation Crossbow, attempting to crush the program before it scaled. The Germans never realized how limited their window was. Every V-2 fired was one less engine, one less tank, one less plane. Each explosion over London drained resources that might have prolonged their ground defenses. In the end, the V-2 was a technological masterpiece, but a tactical illusion. It could not save a dying Reich. Long before the first V-2 fell on London, Allied intelligence had already been chasing rumors of a long-range rocket. British analysts working under the Ministry of Aircraft Production had noticed strange test facilities on aerial photographs near Peenemünde as early as 1942, but confirming their suspicions was difficult. Spy reports were inconsistent, coded messages vague. Some scientists dismissed the idea entirely. The physics, they argued, were impossible. But the British engineer R.V. Jones, head of scientific intelligence, refused to ignore the evidence. It was Jones who first pieced together the puzzle: fragments of information from resistance groups, aerial photos, and intercepted communications. He warned the War Cabinet that Germany was developing a new kind of weapon, unlike anything seen before. His report led directly to Operation Hydra, the massive bombing raid on Peenemünde in 1943. Though the raid slowed production, it didn't stop the program. After the move to the Mittelwerk tunnels, intelligence dried up. The Allies could only infer from launch patterns and radar traces that something powerful was being fired from occupied Europe. By early 1945, British and American teams were competing not only to stop the rockets but to capture the men behind them. Codenamed Operation Backfire and Operation Paperclip, these missions aimed to seize German technology before the Soviets reached it. The Allies realized that whoever controlled this knowledge would dominate the post-war world, not with bombs, but with rockets. The intelligence race became a shadow war within a war, fought not with bullets, but with blueprints. The V-2 was more than a military weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the brutality of human innovation. Inside the Mittelwerk tunnels, the conditions were beyond imagination. Prisoners from concentration camps were forced to work in absolute darkness, standing in ankle-deep mud, surrounded by the stench of death and chemicals. They assembled precision instruments by hand, instruments that would then rain destruction on foreign cities. For every engineer who celebrated a successful launch, thousands of slaves suffered in silence below ground. When Allied troops liberated the Dora Mittelbau camp in April 1945, they found piles of corpses, the machinery of industrialized death mixed with rocket parts. One U.S. officer wrote in his diary, "The rockets were built on blood." Yet, in the years that followed, many of the same engineers responsible for those rockets were quietly relocated to America, their expertise deemed too valuable to ignore. The V-2's legacy became a question of morality. Can progress built on suffering still be called progress? For the Americans, the answer was pragmatic. In the coming atomic age, survival depended not on purity but on power, and so, as Berlin burned and the Reich collapsed, the real race began. Not for victory in Europe, but for the future, because whoever found Germany's rockets first would inherit tomorrow's world. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Soviet artillery thundered on the outskirts of Berlin, while American columns raced across central Germany. Amid the chaos, a quiet, invisible race was underway, not for territory, but for knowledge. Operation Paperclip had begun. Across the front lines, Allied intelligence units known as T-forces received orders, secure research centers, laboratories, and scientists before the Soviets did. The focus was clear: jet propulsion, atomic research, and rockets. The last of these would become the most valuable prize of all. As the U.S. Army's 1st and 9th Armies advanced into Thuringia and the Harz Mountains, reconnaissance units began hearing rumors: strange underground factories, convoys of trucks carrying cylinders and blueprints, and a group of German scientists attempting to surrender to the Americans. The target: Peenemunde's surviving engineers. and the rocket components hidden in the mountains near Nordhausen, the Mittelwerk facility. When American troops of the 104th Infantry Division entered Nordhausen on April 11th, they expected another small town. Instead, they uncovered a nightmare. Beyond the town lay a camp, Mittelbau-Dora, filled with skeletal survivors and rows of dead prisoners. The stench of decomposition hung in the air. The soldiers who entered those tunnels would never forget what they saw. Hundreds of corpses stacked beside unfinished rockets, rails, and steel beams. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later write that Nordhausen was one of the most horrifying discoveries of the entire war. But deeper in the mountain, hidden behind sealed steel doors, they found something else. Gleaming fuselages, crates of components, racks of gyroscopes and control mechanisms, each stamped with serial numbers, each part of something larger, the V-2. When engineers from the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps arrived days later, led by Major James P. Hamill, they began cataloging what they found. The parts were intact: engines, tanks, nozzles, fins, enough material to reassemble at least a dozen complete missiles. At that same moment, another chapter unfolded hundreds of miles south. Wernher von Braun, along with about 120 of his top engineers, had fled Peenemünde weeks earlier. Knowing the Soviets would kill or imprison them, they loaded trucks with their most valuable documents: design blueprints, guidance data, engine specifications, and drove toward Bavaria. They planned to surrender to the Americans. They reached the town of Oberammergau, where von Braun's deputy, Magnus von Braun, approached a U.S. Army private and spoke in broken English. "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We wish to surrender." The Americans were stunned. Within hours, U.S. intelligence realized they had captured the very men behind Hitler's rockets. From that moment, the race was effectively over. The United States had secured the scientists, the plans, and the hardware. The Soviets would soon reach Peenemünde, but they would find little left to take. Over the following weeks, trucks carried the dismantled rockets from Nordhausen to the port of Antwerp. From there, they were shipped across the Atlantic to the United States under the classified Operation Hermes, part of Paperclip's broader mission to transfer German scientific knowledge. In total, over 300 railcars of V-2 components were recovered and transported. American engineers began referring to the massive shipment simply as Project Overcast. But while Washington celebrated its acquisition, a different emotion filled the men who examined the discovery firsthand: unease. The American scientists who walked through the tunnels of Mittelwerk saw not only machinery, but the moral cost of progress. They had seen the bodies. They had seen the conditions. They knew these rockets had been built with blood, and yet they also knew what they held in their hands could redefine the future of war, and perhaps of humanity itself. The war in Europe would end within weeks. But in the laboratories and military bases of America, another battle was about to begin. One fought not against nations, but against time, the battle to understand, rebuild, and surpass the V-2. Because as the U.S. Army prepared to reassemble the captured rockets at a testing range in New Mexico, its scientists were about to realize just how far behind they truly were. Summer 1945. In the searing heat of the New Mexico desert, the future of warfare was being uncrated piece by piece. At White Sands Proving Ground, a barren expanse of sand and sky stretching across southern New Mexico, American scientists and military engineers gathered around the remains of what had once been Hitler's most secret weapon. Crates stamped with the German eagle were unloaded under tight security. Inside lay the relics of a fallen empire: engines, fins, nozzles, gyroscopes, fuel pumps, each part meticulously labeled in German. Major James Hamill and his Ordnance Corps team began the painstaking process of reconstruction. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The engineers were stunned at the level of sophistication: welded tanks with precision tolerances, electrical wiring systems, and control circuitry so advanced that some thought it impossible they had been designed during wartime. The V-2 rocket assembly project had officially begun. Working under secrecy, the U.S. Army grouped the effort into two branches. One focused on reverse engineering the rocket, the other on testing it. Dozens of German engineers, including von Braun and his team, were quietly relocated to the United States under the newly formalized Operation Paperclip. Their arrival was controversial. These were men who had built weapons for Hitler, yet their knowledge was priceless. Many of the American scientists admitted, reluctantly, that without them, progress would take decades. At first, communication was slow. Technical manuals had to be translated, measurements in metric had to be converted, but as von Braun's team explained each system, the magnitude of what they had accomplished became clear. The engine itself, a masterpiece of design, burned a mix of 75% ethanol and liquid oxygen, producing 25 tons of thrust. The Germans had developed fuel injectors capable of atomizing propellant evenly under extreme pressure, a technique the Americans were still struggling to master. The guidance system, compact and elegant, used spinning gyroscopes that provided continuous data to analog computers, adjusting the rocket's trajectory mid-flight. The precision and stability of these systems shocked the Americans, who realized they were years, perhaps a decade, behind. At White Sands, the first reconstructed V-2 was mounted on a launch pad. Engineers double-checked every wire, every valve, every bolt. There was an eerie awareness among them. This was not their creation. It was an artifact of genius and horror, built by men who had served tyranny, now repurposed by those who had defeated it. On April 16, 1946, under a clear desert sky, the countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, ignition. A low rumble turned into a thunderous roar as flames erupted beneath the rocket. The massive machine rose slowly at first, then accelerated, leaving behind a trail of fire and white smoke. For the first time on American soil, a ballistic missile had reached the edge of space. It climbed to an altitude of 70 miles, then arced gracefully and fell back to Earth. The test was a success. For the U.S. Army scientists watching from bunkers miles away, it was both awe-inspiring and sobering. The war was over, yet this launch marked the beginning of something far greater. After the flight, American engineers examined the data. The results confirmed their fears. Germany's rocket program had surpassed every other nation's understanding of propulsion, aerodynamics, and guidance. The V-2 wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a blueprint for the future of space exploration. In the months that followed, the U.S. military conducted dozens of test launches, refining their understanding of the technology. Each success deepened a realization, one both exhilarating and haunting. The road to the stars had been paved by a regime that had enslaved millions. Von Braun and his men were transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas, where they continued their work under American supervision. At the same time, the Soviet Union began launching its own captured V-2s from a base near Kapustin Yar, using German engineers taken from the Peenemünde region. The Cold War's technological race had already begun, before the war's ashes had cooled. In Washington, military strategists debated the implications. The V-2's range was only a few hundred kilometers, but with improved engines and larger warheads, the concept could reach continents. For the first time, the idea of an intercontinental ballistic missile seemed within reach. And beyond that, beyond war, loomed another dream. If a rocket could reach the edge of space, perhaps one day it could carry men beyond it. Yet for now, in the desert silence of New Mexico, the awe was tempered by something deeper, a quiet recognition that this triumph was not theirs alone. The United States had won the war. But when it came to the science of rocketry, Germany had won the future first. The war was over. Europe was in ruins. But amid the devastation, a new kind of conquest had begun. Not over land or ideology, but over knowledge. By late 1946, Operation Paperclip had quietly relocated more than 2,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians to the United States. Among them were the brightest minds from Peenemünde, Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, Arthur Rudolph, and dozens of others who had once pledged loyalty to Hitler's regime. They were given new identities, clean records and fresh American lives. Many arrived with their families, escorted to isolated compounds in Texas and Alabama. Their task was clear: take the remnants of the V-2 and turn it into something greater, something that could serve America's future. In Fort Bliss, von Braun's team worked day and night. They rebuilt engines, tested gyroscopes, and drafted blueprints for larger, more powerful rockets. The war had forced them to build weapons. Now they dreamed of building vehicles that could touch the stars. Von Braun, always the visionary, spoke of satellites, lunar landings, and interplanetary travel. To many U.S. officials, his ideas sounded like fantasy. But his calculations were flawless, and his charm undeniable. Soon, he had the trust of the U.S. Army's upper ranks. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was making similar moves. From the ruins of Germany's eastern zone, the Red Army had seized entire rocket factories along with captured engineers. They were transported to Kaliningrad and Moscow, where the Soviets began constructing their own V-2 copies under the supervision of Sergei Korolev, a brilliant but ruthless engineer who had survived Stalin's gulags. The race for post-war supremacy had shifted from battlefields to laboratories. By 1948, both sides had launched dozens of successful test flights. The U.S. produced Project Hermes, a military research program that used modified V-2s for high-altitude experiments. These tests gathered crucial data about atmospheric pressure, cosmic rays, and radiation, information that would later be vital for human spaceflight. But for von Braun and his team, there was still a shadow that followed them, the moral cost of their achievements. During the war, the V-2 rockets had been assembled not in pristine factories, but in underground concentration camps such as Mittelwerk, where tens of thousands of slave laborers from Dora Mittelbau had perished. Malnutrition, disease, and brutal punishment were commonplace. Each rocket's triumph carried the weight of unimaginable suffering. When American journalists uncovered this history, controversy erupted. How could a nation that had fought against tyranny now welcome its engineers? The U.S. government defended its decision bluntly. If we don't bring them here, the Soviets will. It was cold logic, but it defined the early Cold War. In 1950, von Braun's team was moved to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where they began developing a new generation of rockets, the Redstone, Jupiter, and Pershing missiles. These designs drew directly from the V-2's core principles: improved engines, stabilized guidance, and longer ranges. And soon, von Braun's vision began to take root beyond the military. With the emergence of television and public fascination with science, he became something unexpected, a celebrity scientist. He appeared in magazines, gave lectures, and even collaborated with Walt Disney to produce educational films about space exploration. In one broadcast, his smooth German accent described the possibility of man-made satellites orbiting Earth, a concept that seemed like science fiction in 1955. But across the Atlantic, in the Soviet Union, Korolev's team was already preparing to make that fiction real. They had mastered their own version of the V-2, and with it, designed something larger, the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. In October 1957, a signal beeped across the heavens. Beep. 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 Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, had entered orbit. The world was stunned. The Soviets had beaten America to space, and once again, the roots of that victory could be traced back to the tunnels of Mittelwerk, to the dark heart of the Third Reich's rocket dream. Within months, the United States responded, establishing NASA in 1958. And at its core, leading its first rocket program, stood the man who had once built weapons for Hitler, Wernher von Braun. The transformation was complete. The V-2, the world's first ballistic missile, had given birth to the space age. But beneath the triumph, one question lingered. Could humanity's greatest leap forward ever be separated from the darkness that created it? The V-2 had begun as a weapon of vengeance, Vergeltungswaffe 2, built to terrify cities and crush morale. But within a decade, it had become the foundation of human spaceflight. By the early 1960s, the echoes of the rocket's legacy stretched from the ruins of Nordhausen to the deserts of New Mexico and the coasts of Florida. In that short span, a weapon of war had evolved into a symbol of exploration. Yet the transition was not as clean as history books often suggest. At White Sands Proving Ground, American engineers had spent the late 1940s reassembling the captured German rockets. The first successful U.S. V-2 launch occurred on April 16, 1946, less than a year after the end of the war. It soared over 100 kilometers into the upper atmosphere before crashing back into the desert. The event marked the first time humans had touched the edge of space, but it was a strange victory. The rocket that broke the sky had once broken cities. The data that now promised to advance science had once guided destruction. Scientists like Theodore von Karman and Robert Goddard's former associates, who had pioneered early American rocketry, watched the V-2's success with a mixture of awe and discomfort. They recognized its brilliance and the uncomfortable truth that their own nation's research had lagged behind until the war forced its hand. The Americans who studied the captured V-2 realized quickly that its complexity went beyond anything they had imagined. Every nut, every turbine, every inch of wiring represented thousands of hours of precision, and years of experimentation the Allies had never matched. It was humbling. It was unsettling. In classified reports filed by U.S. Army ordnance officers in 1946, one line stood out: "We are several years behind in rocket technology. The Germans have already achieved what we are only beginning to understand." That admission shaped U.S. military and scientific policy for decades. Billions were invested in missile research, jet propulsion, and nuclear delivery systems. The Cold War arms race, with its ICBMs and space launches, all stemmed from that single realization inside the laboratories of Peenemünde and the tunnels of Mittelwerk. But as the United States pushed forward, questions about moral responsibility refused to fade. Investigations into Mittelwerk revealed that over 20,000 slave laborers had died constructing the V-2, more lives lost in its creation than in all of its wartime launches combined. Survivors of Dora Mittelbau recounted the endless work shifts, the suffocating air, the hangings conducted to motivate prisoners. In a quiet moment years later, an American officer who had first entered those tunnels was asked what he remembered most. He didn't speak of the rockets or the blueprints or the technology. He said only the silence, the smell, and the feeling that we had just found mankind's most brilliant achievement built by mankind's darkest act. It was a paradox that would haunt generations of scientists. Von Braun himself would later claim that he had been forced to work under the Nazi regime, that his true goal had always been space travel. His charm and talent shielded him, and history, eager for heroes during the space race, accepted that version. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, it was the ultimate triumph of that transformation. The rocket that lifted humanity into space, or the Saturn V, bore the unmistakable lineage of the V-2. Its chief architect, Wernher von Braun. Standing before the world's cameras, America celebrated the conquest of space. Few mentioned that the road to the moon had passed through Nordhausen, but history remembers, because every time a rocket ignites, every time a column of flame lifts something toward the stars, it carries the DNA of that first terrible invention, a weapon born from war that became a vessel for wonder. The V-2 was both the end of one world and the beginning of another, and for the scientists who once stood in that dusty hangar in New Mexico, holding the blueprints of their enemy's creation, the realization remained the same: simple, humbling, eternal. They had not merely captured a rocket, they had captured the future. In the story of the V-2, history folds in on itself: progress and destruction, genius and cruelty, vision and horror intertwined like the steel veins of the rocket itself. The scientists who studied that captured weapon in 1945 didn't just glimpse Germany's technology, they glimpsed humanity's future and the terrible price it sometimes demands. Every innovation that followed, from the Cold War missiles that held the world hostage to the rockets that carried astronauts into orbit, traced its lineage back to the same dark origin. The same calculations, the same engines, the same dream of reaching beyond the sky. The V-2 was more than a weapon. It was a mirror. It showed mankind's limitless capacity for creation and its equal capacity for destruction. Inside its sleek, aerodynamic body lay the contradiction of the 20th century, that the same knowledge capable of ending cities could also carry humanity toward the stars. When the Americans examined that first captured rocket, they realized they were not only years behind the Germans in science, they were decades behind in confronting the moral weight of such power. Because the V-2 was not just a machine of metal and fire. It was a warning, a reminder that knowledge without conscience can burn brighter than any flame and consume everything in its path. Yet, in the quiet after the war, amid the ruins of Europe, that same knowledge ignited something greater: curiosity, ambition, and the determination to ensure that the future would be shaped not by vengeance, but by vision. From the tunnels of Mittelwerk to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, the journey of the V-2 tells a single, haunting truth: that humanity's path forward will always walk the line between shadow and light, and every time a rocket pierces the clouds, leaving its trail of smoke across the sky, it carries within it not only the legacy of war, but the hope that this time, our reach toward the heavens might finally rise above the darkness that first gave it wings.